they know they are not designed to carry, and would gladly yield if their husbands would come through for them. Since we deal with the husband's responsibilities in detail and for married men only, I want to focus on the wife's role here. Actually, both spouses' roles are summarized in Ephesians 5:33. Each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself. And the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. A husband is commanded to love his wife, and that is not dependent on his emotions. A wife is commanded to respect her husband, even if he hasn't earned that respect in her mind. But too many Christian women are taking their marriage cues from television or their girlfriends instead of from God's Word. Many women were raised in single-parent homes and in a matriarchal environment over which they had no control. The problem is that they have come to think this is how things are supposed to be. Since Mama ran their home, they figure they need to run their home now that they're married. But a woman who tries to take charge of her marriage is trampling on the respect that she owes to her husband through God's command to her. Many men are functioning as poor husbands, at least in part because their wives are operating far outside of God's standard. So in this booklet, we want to find out what a wife's biblical role entails, and what a woman looks and acts like when she is fulfilling her calling from the Lord in relation to her husband. Over the next 3 chapters, I plan to cover the following areas: submitting to your husband, seducing your husband, and surrendering to your husband. Submitting to your husband. Now, I know that the mental defenses go up for many women when they hear the dreaded S word, because the concept of submission flies in the face of everything that our culture today teaches, models, and values. But God's Word sits in judgment on our culture, and not vice versa. One reason that submission is such a hated word is that it has been so badly misunderstood and misused, often intentionally, that few people know what it really means. Submission is not a bad word, but when people make a good word bad, it becomes bad, even though it's good. I was speaking at a Promise Keepers conference for men at a time when members of the National Organization for Women, NOW, were protesting against the idea of submission, saying that it turns women into second-class citizens. But at the time that the president of NOW was complaining about the terrible oppression of women being perpetrated by Christians who teach submission, I heard her call the organization's vice president and give her instructions to fulfill a certain task. In other words, the president of NOW was asking her subordinate to submit to her leadership. Feminists recognize that submission is appropriate in some roles, and they practice it themselves in these settings. They just don't want to see the concept of submission introduced into marriage, because they want to insist that marriage is a totally egalitarian relationship with no one in a leadership position. You see, submission is only a bad idea when it's used in an arena where we don't want it to appear. But it is God's idea, so it can't be bad. In fact, we'll see below that the members of the Godhead practice submission to one another. The biblical word submission means to line up underneath. It's a voluntary word, an act of the will. In other words, we must choose to submit. Perhaps the best illustration is a yield sign on the highway. Whereas a stop sign means stop, period, no questions asked, you have a choice to make at a yield sign, but your choice carries certain consequences. If you think you can beat the oncoming car and get out of its way, you may decide to shoot on through the intersection instead of yielding. But if you do, and a collision occurs, you will be at fault because the other vehicle has the right of way. Regardless of your view that you were right, the law will consider you to be in rebellion against its statutes. The same is true in a wife's relationship with her husband. God tells wives to submit to their husbands as to the Lord.